People talk about discipleship a lot these days. You hear about discipleship classes. You hear about discipleship programs. Churches have different ways they try to do discipleship. Sometimes it means going to a Bible study. Sometimes it means being in a small group. Sometimes it means signing up for a series of lessons. We mean well, of course. We want to follow Jesus. We want to grow in our faith. We want to learn more about God. But the way we often think about discipleship today, it's pretty far from what it meant in the first century. It really wasn't a class at all back then. It was something much more. Imagine you lived in the first century. You wanted to follow a teacher. You wanted to learn from them. What would that look like? It wasn't like signing up for an evening course at a local college. It wasn't about getting a certificate at the end. It was about your whole life. It was about choosing one person to follow, to imitate, to learn everything from. You would leave your old life behind. You would give up your old job. You would live with this teacher. You would walk where they walked. You would eat what they ate. You would listen to every word they said. You would watch every move they made. This was discipleship in the time of Jesus. It was an apprenticeship. It was a total life commitment. Let's look at the world Jesus lived in. It helps us understand. In Jewish culture, young men often followed rabbis. These students were called Talmidim. A Talmud wasn't just someone who listened to lectures. A Talmud lived with the rabbi, they served the rabbi. They traveled with the rabbi. They discussed the Torah with the rabbi, they asked questions, they observed how the rabbi lived out the law. The goal was to become like the rabbi. The goal was to absorb the rabbi's teachings, yes, but also the rabbi's character. It was about taking on the rabbi's yoke. The yoke was the rabbi's interpretation of the law. It was his way of life, it was heavy, it was a commitment. And not just anyone could become a Talmud. Usually the rabbi chose the students, and the students had to be really good. They had to be smart, they had to show promise. Most young men, if they weren't chosen by a rabbi, they would just go into their family business. They would learn their father's trade, they would become fishermen or carpenters or farmers. They would live a normal life. They wouldn't be scholars, they wouldn't be religious leaders. Then Jesus came along, he was different, he didn't wait for the best and brightest to come to him. He went and called ordinary men. He called fishermen like Peter, Andrew, James, and John. He called a tax collector like Matthew. These weren't the people rabbis usually picked. They weren't scholars, they probably weren't top of their class, but Jesus called them. And he said, "Follow me." And these men that you have as a kid, because as they dropped their nets, they left their boats. Matthew left his tax booth. They left their entire way of life. They left their jobs. They left their families, at least for a time. This was a huge sacrifice. This was not a casual decision. This was a radical change. It meant giving up everything they knew. It meant stepping into the unknown. They didn't just meet Jesus on Sundays. They didn't just go to a weekly meeting. They lived with him. They traveled with him everywhere he went. If Jesus walked from Capernaum to Jerusalem, they walked with him. If he taught by the Sea of Galilee, they were there listening. If he went into a house to eat, they ate with him. If he went up a mountain to pray, they were nearby. They saw everything, they heard everything, they experienced everything with him. Think about what that means. It means they saw how Jesus treated people, they saw how he talked to the sick, they saw how he interacted with children. They saw how he responded to criticism from the Pharisees. They saw his patience, they saw his compassion, they saw his anger when he cleansed the temple. They saw him pray, they saw him get tired, they saw him cry, they saw him laugh. This was learning by immersion. It wasn't just about hearing words, it was about seeing a life. Jesus wasn't just teaching abstract ideas, he was living them out in front of his disciples every single day. He was showing them what it looked like to live under God's rule. He was showing them what it meant to walk in perfect obedience to the Father. When Jesus taught, it often happened in a real-life situation. He might be walking through a field and talk about the birds of the air or the lilies of the field. He might be at a dinner and teach about humility. He might be on a boat and teach about faith in a storm. The lessons were directly connected to their daily experiences. They weren't in a lecture hall. There wasn't a whiteboard, there weren't handouts. It was organic, it was natural. It was deeply personal, and when they didn't understand something, they could ask him. Often he would teach a parable to the crowds. Then, later in private, his disciples would come to him and ask, "What did that parable mean?" And Jesus would explain it to them. He would take the time to clarify. He would patiently teach them more deeply. This was personalized instruction. This was one-on-one mentoring or small group mentoring. It was not a mass education system. He didn't just teach them with words. He gave them work to do. He sent them out. He gave them authority to heal the sick and cast out demons. But he told them to preach the good news. This was part of their training. This was practical experience. They weren't just learning about ministry. They were doing ministry. They were putting what they learned into practice. And they made mistakes. They argued about who was the greatest. They fell asleep when Jesus asked them to pray. Or Peter denied him. Thomas doubted him. They often misunderstood what he was saying. But Jesus didn't give up on them. He corrected them. He encouraged them. He restored them. This is a huge part of first century discipleship too. It's messy, it's about failure and forgiveness. It's about growth, not perfection from the start. So let's break down some key characteristics of what discipleship meant for Jesus' followers. First, there was total commitment. We already touched on this. They gave up everything. They literally followed him. They didn't have a second job they did on the side. They didn't go home every night to their families and then check in with Jesus once a week. They were all in. Their lives revolved around Jesus. This kind of commitment seems really radical to us today. We have so many things pulling for our attention. We have jobs, hobbies, families, responsibilities. But for them, Jesus became their primary responsibility. He was their life. Second, it was about imitation of life. This is crucial. It wasn't just about knowing Jesus' words. It was about living like Jesus. The goal of the Talmud was to become so much like their rabbi that people could tell who their rabbi was just by watching them. Jesus said in Luke chapter 6, verse 40, "A student is not above his teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher." This means the disciple was to become a living reflection of their master. This goes way beyond knowing facts. This is about character, this is about values, this is about actions, it's about being molded into the same shape. And third, it was relationship-centered. Discipleship was not a curriculum, it was a person. It was about a deep personal relationship with Jesus. All the teachings, all the miracles, all the experiences, they flowed out of this central relationship. They loved him, they trusted him, they believed in him, and because of that relationship, they were willing to listen to him, obey him, and follow him, even when it was hard. Fourth, it involved practical learning. We talked about how Jesus sent them out. This was not theoretical, this was hands-on training. Imagine learning to be a carpenter. You don't just read books about carpentry, you work with a master carpenter. You watch him. You try what he does. You make mistakes. He corrects you. You learn by doing. This is how Jesus trained his disciples. He was the master craftsman and they were his apprentice. Fifth, it led to transformation. The men Jesus called were ordinary. They were rough around the edges. They had flaws. But spending 3 years living with Jesus, watching him, listening to him, being corrected by him, it changed them. They became new men, they became courageous, they became wise, they became bold. This was not just about adding information to their brains, this was about changing their hearts, their minds, their entire being. It was a complete overhaul. Sixth, it was a communal experience. Discipleship with Jesus was not a solitary journey. The 12 were a community. They lived together, they traveled together, they shared meals. They argued, they supported each other, they encouraged each other, they had a common purpose. They learned from Jesus, but they also learned from each other. They were a family. This sense of community was vital. It was part of how they learned to love and serve each other, which Jesus taught was so important. Seventh, it was mission-oriented. Jesus didn't just train them for their own personal spiritual growth. He trained them for a purpose. He trained them to carry on his mission after he was gone. He was preparing them to be fishers of men. He was preparing them to make more disciples. The Great Commission, go and make disciples of all nations, wasn't a new idea. It was the continuation of the very process they had just experienced with him. They were to replicate what he had done with them. So what exactly wasn't it? Let's be really clear about this. It was not passive information transfer. They weren't just sitting in a pew or a classroom, passively receiving information. They were actively involved, they were asking questions, they were participating in miracles. They were being sent out, it demanded their full engagement, it was not a graduation system. There wasn't an endpoint where they said, okay, I'm a fully formed disciple now, I'm done. Well, discipleship was a lifelong journey. Even after Jesus ascended, they continued to grow. They continued to learn. The Holy Spirit continued to teach them. It was not just head knowledge. While knowing facts about God and His Word is important, it wasn't the sum total. It was about knowing Jesus personally. It was about applying His teachings to every part of their lives. It was about becoming like Him in their actions and attitudes, not just their beliefs. You can know a lot about Jesus without truly following Him in this deep sense. It was not a private pursuit. As we said, it was communal. You couldn't be a first-century disciple of Jesus in isolation. You were part of a group, you were connected to others, you learned with them, from them, and sometimes even through their failures. It was not about convenience, it was about sacrifice. It cost them everything. Their lives were completely uprooted. This is far from the idea of squeezing in a discipleship program when it fits into your schedule. It was their schedule. It was their life. It was not a temporary phase. It was a lifelong identity. Once you chose to follow Jesus, that defined who you were. It was your new identity. You were his. The ultimate goal of this kind of discipleship was deep. Jesus called them to be fishers of men. This meant they were to go out and bring others into the same life-changing relationship with him. They were to help others become his disciples. And how would they do that? By showing them Jesus through their own transformed lives. By teaching them what Jesus taught them. By living with them, modeling for them, and sending them out. Think about it. If you spend 3 years living with someone, observing their every move, listening to their every word, sharing their purpose, you're going to pick up their habit. You're going to start to sound like them. You're going to start to act like them. The disciples became more and more like Jesus. This was the point. They were becoming living extensions of him. And they really needed this immersive training because Jesus was preparing them for something huge. He was preparing them for a time when he wouldn't be physically with them anymore. He was going to leave them. And they would have to carry on his work. They would have to be his hands and feet and voice in the world. This is why the training was so intense. This is why it was so personal. Sometimes we read the Gospels and we see the disciples' failures. They were slow to understand. They were fearful. They were often self-centered. This makes us feel better, perhaps, but it also highlights the patient, persistent work of Jesus. He didn't just teach the perfect, ideal student. He taught real, imperfect people, and he saw them through the transformation. This shows us that discipleship is a process. It takes time. It involves ups and downs. It's not always smooth sailing, but Jesus was committed to them even in their failures. And then a critical piece came. After Jesus rose from the dead and before he ascended, he promised them something vital. He promised them the Holy Spirit. He told them the Spirit would teach them everything. The Spirit would remind them of everything he had told them. The Spirit would empower them. This was crucial. Without the Holy Spirit, they would never be able to truly live out the life Jesus modeled. They would never be able to truly carry on his mission. The Holy Spirit became the ongoing source of their discipleship. The Spirit continued the work of making them more like Jesus. The Spirit gave them power to make more disciples. After Jesus ascended and the Holy Spirit came at Pentecost, we see this model of discipleship continue in the early church. The book of Acts tells us about it. New believers weren't just given a membership card. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. They continued in the apostles' teaching, which was what the apostles had learned directly from Jesus. They shared their lives in fellowship, they ate together, they prayed together, they cared for each other's needs. They even sold possessions to help those who were poor among them. This was a continuation of that immersive, communal, life-transforming discipleship. It was the life of the community. New believers didn't just read a book to learn about Jesus. They lived alongside those who had walked with Jesus, or those who had been discipled by them. They learned by observation, they learned by participation, they learned by being part of a community that was dedicated to following Jesus together. Older believers discipled newer ones simply by living out their faith with them. It was organic, it was relational, it was a shared journey. So why does all this matter today? Why go back 2,000 years to understand something so basic? It matters because our modern idea of discipleship has often become diluted. We've made it into something convenient. We've made it into something we fit into our busy lives. We've often reduced it to a series of lessons or a small group meeting once a week. And while these things can be good, they miss the heart of what Jesus meant. They miss the depth. They miss the total life commitment. First century discipleship was radical. It was demanding, it was relationship-based, it was an apprenticeship of life. It was about a total reorientation around Jesus, it was about becoming like him, it was about living out his teachings in every part of their lives, and it was about helping others do the exact same thing. When Jesus gave the Great Commission, he didn't say, go and start some classes. He said, go and make disciples. He meant, go and reproduce this very process I've just shown you. Go and find people. Bring them into relationship with me. Help them give up everything to follow me. Teach them everything I have commanded you, not just with words, but by living it out with them. Help them become like me, and then send them out to do the same. This changes how we think about what it means to follow Jesus. It means following him isn't just about believing certain things. It's about living in a certain way. It's about letting him be Lord of every part of our lives. Constantly learning from him, imitating him, and letting him transform us from the inside out. It's about being in close relationship with him. It's about living out our faith in community with others. And it's about helping others step into that same transformative journey. It's not a class. It's a life. It was then, and it still should be now.